Major Thomas Reynolds slammed his clipboard onto the metal table so hard the coffee cups jumped. I don't care who she is or where she came from. This is my hangar, my operation. And I am not going to stand here and let some nobody from logistics walk in here and embarrass my entire team in front of the colonel. 6 helicopters, 72 hours, the best engineers in the Air Force defeated. And now a woman nobody had ever heard of was walking through the door. If you've ever been underestimated, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and don't move until the end. The call came in at 3:47 in the morning. Not the kind of call that wakes you up gently. Not the kind that gives you a moment to breathe, to collect yourself, to ease into bad news. This was the kind of call that yanks you straight out of sleep and puts you on your feet before your eyes are even fully open. Colonel Daniel Whitmore grabbed the phone on the first ring, already knowing from the tone of the ringtone, from the hour, from some deep instinct built over 23 years of military service, that whatever was on the other end of that line was going to be bad. Colonel. The voice was Captain Hargreaves, and even through the static of a satellite phone, Whitmore could hear something he had never heard from Hargreaves before. Fear, real fear, controlled, professional, but absolutely present. We have a situation at the northern site. All 6 aircraft are down. We can't explain it, sir. We've been working on it for the last 4 hours and we have nothing. Whitmore said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then say that again. All 6 aircraft, sir, down, ground level. They won't start. Mechanical failure. That's the thing, Colonel. Every diagnostic we run says they're fine. Power systems check out. Fuel systems check out. Navigation is reading normal. Computers show no critical errors. According to every piece of technology we have, those helicopters are ready to fly. But they won't. Whitmore sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. His wife didn't stir. She had learned after 2 decades of being married to a military commander that there were certain phone calls that required her to be asleep even when she wasn't. Then he rubbed his face with one hand. Where's Reynolds? He's been here since the beginning, sir. He's got his whole team. They've been at it for hours. Tell him I'm coming. He dressed in 4 minutes. He was in his vehicle in 5. And as he drove through the frozen Alaskan night, the darkness pressing against the windows from every direction, he thought about what Hargreaves had just told him. 6 helicopters, no errors, won't start. In his entire career, he had never heard of anything like it. Machines failed all the time. That was the nature of machines. They broke down, they showed symptoms. They sent signals that told trained engineers what was wrong and where to look. That was the system. That was how it worked. But machines that said they were fine and then refused to function, that was something else entirely. That was the kind of problem that didn't have a manual. That was the kind of problem that kept commanders awake for the rest of their lives. When Whitmore arrived at the hangar, the scene was nothing like what he expected. He had expected urgency. He had expected frantic movement, people running back and forth, tools everywhere, the organized chaos of a team fighting hard against a deadline. Instead, what he found was something closer to exhaustion. 12 technicians, many of them the best in their field, were standing or sitting in various positions around 6 enormous military helicopters, and every single one of them had the same expression on their face. It was the expression of people who had been fighting as hard as they could fight for as long as they could fight and had finally stopped. Not because they chose to stop, but because they had simply run out of things to try. Major Thomas Reynolds was standing near the first helicopter with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He was a big man, Reynolds, broad shoulders, military posture, the kind of face that had weathered genuine difficult situations without flinching. He had been stationed in 3 different combat zones. He had repaired aircraft under enemy fire. He had once kept a rescue helicopter operational using spare parts from a crashed vehicle while taking indirect mortar rounds less than a mile away. I was not a man who gave up easily. But tonight, Thomas Reynolds looked like a man who had given up. He looked up when Whitmore walked in, and the colonel saw it clearly, the slight flicker of something behind the major's eyes. Relief, maybe, or maybe just the desperate hope that someone with authority could somehow change what the technology could not. Reynolds, Whitmore stopped beside him. Talk to me. Reynolds uncrossed his arms. He picked up the clipboard from the nearest workbench and handed it over. Everything we've tried is right there, sir. We started with the obvious: power systems, fuel controls, ignition sequences. All clean. We moved to secondary systems. Clean. Communication equipment. Navigation modules. Clean. We ran every diagnostic protocol we have. Twice. The computers say these aircraft are operational. But they're not. No, sir, they are not. Whitmore looked at the clipboard. It was covered in notes, technical abbreviations, check marks next to dozens of items. It was the record of extraordinary effort. He handed it back without saying anything and walked slowly toward the first helicopter. I wasn't an engineer. He had never been an engineer. His expertise was command strategy, the larger picture of how operations fit together and how people needed to move within them. But he knew enough to understand what he was looking at when he looked at this aircraft. And what he was looking at was a machine that appeared by every visible measure to be in perfect condition. That made it worse somehow. A broken machine you could see was a problem you could solve. A machine that looked perfect but refused to work was something different. It was a mystery. And mysteries in the middle of a critical operation with a storm moving in and temperatures falling and a ticking clock on the wall were not things that commanders had the luxury of tolerating. He turned back to Reynolds. How long before the weather becomes a problem? Storm's system is tracking to hit within 36 hours, sir. Maybe less. If we can't get these aircraft airborne before then, transport becomes complicated. And if transport becomes complicated, the operation fails. Whitmore finished the sentence so Reynolds didn't have to. He stood still for a moment. Then he made the decision quietly and, without drama, the way he had always made hard decisions. I'll give you until 0600 tomorrow. If those aircraft aren't operational by then, we pull them out and we call it. Reynolds nodded, his jaw tightened further. Understood, sir. Whitmore walked back toward the entrance. He stopped without turning around. Reynolds, I know you've done everything you know how to do. I'm not questioning your team. I want you to know that. A pause. But find the answer. He left without waiting for a response. Inside the hangars, a silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. The 12 technicians who had been standing around the helicopters had all heard the conversation. They all understood what had just been said. 6 hours. If they couldn't solve this in 6 hours, everything stopped. Everything failed. The mission, the training exercise, the months of planning, the resources invested, all of it. One of the younger technicians, a kid named Specialist David Okafor, who had been in the Air Force for less than 18 months, quietly walked up beside Reynolds. Major, his voice was low. I have an idea. Reynolds looked at him. I know it probably won't work, Okafor added quickly, but at this point, tell me. There's a woman in the logistics division. Her name is Carter. Emily Carter. I worked with her about a year ago on a different kind of grounding issue. Something nobody else could figure out. She found it in about, he paused. She found it fast, sir, real fast. And she found it in a way that nobody expected. Reynolds stared at him for a moment. A logistics specialist. Yes, sir. You want to bring in a logistics specialist to fix aircraft that my entire engineering team cannot fix. Okafor held his ground. I want to bring in someone who might be able to think about it differently, sir. That's all I'm saying. I don't have any better ideas. I'm not sure any of us do. Reynolds was quiet for a long time. Around them, the hangar hummed faintly with the sound of equipment computers still running. Diagnostic machines, still cycling the background noise of technology doing its job and coming up empty over and over again. He looked at the helicopters. He looked at the clock on the wall. He thought about Whitmore's voice, about the specific way the colonel had said find the answer, about what it would mean if they didn't. Make the call, he said. Okafor had his phone out before Reynolds finished the sentence. Emily Carter answered on the third ring. She was already awake. She had a habit of waking before dawn, something she had developed during her early years, doing maintenance work in rural facilities, where the heating was unreliable, and the cold had a way of forcing you out of bed whether you wanted to get up or not. She was sitting at the small table in her quarters with a cup of black coffee and a technical manual she had been working through in her spare time. A manual nobody had assigned to her, a manual about maintenance systems she didn't technically need to understand for her current job, but that she had picked up anyway because Emily Carter had always believed that the best way to solve problems you hadn't faced yet was to understand things you didn't currently need to know. Carter, she answered. Specialist Carter. The voice was young, slightly nervous. This is Okafor, David Okafor. We worked together on the Bravo site drainage issue about a year ago. She remembered him immediately, a quiet kid, thoughtful. He had been the only one on that particular crew who had thought to ask why the drainage issue was happening instead of just trying to fix the symptoms. I remember, she said. What's going on? He told her. He told her quickly and clearly all 6 helicopters, 72 hours, every diagnostic test, every component, replaced everything attempted, nothing working. He told her about the storm system, about Colonel Whitmore's deadline, about the 6 hours remaining. Emily listened without interrupting. She had a way of listening that other people sometimes found unsettling because she didn't fill silence with questions or acknowledgments. She just listened, and you could never quite tell if she was following along closely or had already moved 3 steps ahead. When Okafor finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Who's in charge of the team over there?" she asked. "Major Reynolds, ma'am." "Does he know you're calling me?" A brief pause. "He told me to make the call." "All right." She set down her coffee. "I'm coming." She arrived at the hangar 22 minutes later. She was not what Major Reynolds had expected, although he would have had difficulty saying exactly what he had expected. She was in her early 30s, medium height. She carried a single bag, not an enormous kit of specialized equipment, not the kind of gear you would expect from someone called in to handle a crisis. Just a standard maintenance bag, the kind anyone might carry. She walked through the hangar entrance and stopped. She didn't go immediately to the helicopters. She didn't pull out a diagnostic tool or a computer tablet or a checklist. She just stood there near the entrance and looked. Not at any particular helicopter specifically, at the space, at the arrangement, at everything at once. Reynolds watched her from across the hangar. He had his arms crossed again. Beside him, 2 of his senior technicians, Master Sergeant Louise Donnelly and Staff Sergeant Patrick Hayes, stood with expressions that were carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that is actually very close to dismissive but has enough professionalism layered over it to pass as respectful. "That's her," Donnelly said quietly enough that only Reynolds and Hayes could hear. "That's her," Reynolds confirmed. "She's a logistics tech." "Yes," a pause. "With respect, sir." "I know Donnelly. We've been working on this for 3 days. We have. I know what we have." His voice was quiet, final. "Let her work." Emily had started moving now. She walked slowly in no apparent hurry along the side of the first helicopter. She wasn't examining it closely, not yet. She was moving the way someone moves when they're reading a room, taking in the atmosphere before focusing on the details. She ran one hand lightly along the exterior surface as she passed. She paused occasionally for no reason that anyone observing could identify. She crouched down near the base of the second helicopter and looked at the ground beneath it. She stood back up. She walked to the third helicopter and did the same thing. Donnelly's patience was wearing thin. "What exactly is she looking for?" she said, no longer bothering to keep her voice low. Reynolds shot her a look. She fell silent. Emily had reached the fourth helicopter. She was looking at the area where it connected to the ground, not under the aircraft, just at the boundary between the machine and the surface beneath it. She tilted her head slightly, the way a person does when something doesn't quite add up. Then she turned and looked directly at Reynolds. He walked over. "Tell me about the parking situation," she said. He blinked. "The parking situation. These aircraft, were they all parked here for the entire duration? All 6 in these exact positions for the full 72 hours?" "Yes, same positions since the exercise began." "And before that?" "Before the exercise, they came in from different sites, different bases. But they all arrived roughly at the same time," Reynolds thought about it. "Within about 8 hours of each other, yes." Emily nodded slowly. She looked at the line of aircraft again. Same weather conditions across all 6. Same time exposure. Same location. She said it quietly, almost to herself. Then she turned back to Reynolds. "You said every diagnostic came back clean." "Every one. But the diagnostics are designed to find internal failures. They look inside the systems." "That's correct." "What were you using to assess external conditions, environmental factors, ground interface?" Reynolds opened his mouth, then he closed it. In 20 years of military aircraft maintenance, he had never once been asked that question. Not because it was a complicated question, not because it was a radical concept, but because the protocol, the training, the entire framework within which he and his team operated was built around the principle that you found failures inside machines by looking inside machines. External conditions were a checklist item, a box you ticked at the beginning, not something you came back to. not something you investigated with the same depth and rigor you applied to internal systems. Emily watched his face carefully. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't scoring a point. She was genuinely focused on what his expression was telling her. "We did an initial environmental assessment," he said finally. "Standard protocol, temperature range, moisture levels, wind exposure. And you found those to be within normal parameters." "Yes." "On the surface." Another pause. "What do you mean?" She looked at him steadily. "Major, I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as a real question, not as a challenge. Because I'm not trying to make you or your team look bad. I'm trying to find what we missed." He uncrossed his arms. "Go ahead. When you did your environmental assessment, were you looking for a problem you expected to find, or were you looking to understand what the environment had actually done?" The hangar was very quiet. Donnelly and Hayes were standing close enough now that they could hear the conversation clearly. The other technicians had gradually drifted in the same direction, unconsciously pulled by the change in the atmosphere. Reynolds said nothing for a moment. "Those are different things," Emily said. "That's all I'm saying. When we expect to find normal, we tend to find normal, even when normal isn't what's actually there." Reynolds looked at the helicopters. He looked back at her, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted barely perceptibly in a way that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite acceptance, but was something approaching both. "So what are you looking for?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. And there was something disarming about how straightforwardly she said it. She wasn't pretending to have an answer. She wasn't performing confidence. She was just telling the truth. "But I think the answer is in what all 6 aircraft have in common. Not individually, together. Something that hit all of them the same way in the same place at the same time. The diagnostics would have caught anything that significant." She shook her head gently. "Only if it crossed the threshold the diagnostics were designed to detect." Detect, what if it didn't? What if it was something small enough that the system's margin of error absorbed it? Something that would never show up on a readout, because the readout wasn't built to look for something that subtle. Hayes spoke up for the first time. "If it's below the diagnostic threshold, it might not even be causing a real failure. It might just be causing a—" He stopped himself. "A delay," Emily finished for him. "A hesitation. Not a full failure, a resistance." Hayes stared at her. Emily was already moving. She went back to the first helicopter, this time with purpose. She crouched down and opened a small access panel on the lower fuselage. Not a major panel, not the kind that led to primary systems. A maintenance panel. The kind that experienced technicians had checked 100 times and dismissed just as quickly because it housed secondary connections, interface wiring, the kind of components that almost never failed because they were simple and robust and had very little reason to malfunction. She looked inside without touching anything for almost a full minute. Then she reached in carefully and touched the wiring harness at the back of the compartment. "Donnelly," she said without looking up. The master sergeant stepped forward. "Ma'am, come look at this." Donnelly crouched beside her and looked where Emily was pointing. At first she saw nothing. Standard wiring, standard connectors, everything in the right place. Then Emily shifted the beam of her flashlight to a specific angle. Donnelly leaned in slightly. "There, in the very back, on the secondary connection interface. A faint discoloration, barely visible, the kind of thing you would never notice unless you were looking for something that the diagnostics had given you no reason to look for." "What is that?" Donnelly said. "Corrosion," Emily said. "Very early stage, caused by moisture getting into this compartment over a period of sustained cold exposure. It's increased the resistance in this connection. Not enough for the diagnostic to flag it, the system still reads a signal. It's just reading a signal that's slightly weaker than it needs to be for the startup sequence to clear." Donnelly's face went through several expressions very quickly. Recognition, disbelief, then something more complicated, harder to name. "That's—" She stopped. "Small," Emily said. "I know, it's the smallest possible thing." Hayes had his own flashlight out now and was looking at the second helicopter's equivalent access panel. "It's here too," he said. His voice was flat with shock. "Check all 6, Emily said quietly. The answer came back in under 4 minutes. All 6. Same panel, same connection, same microscopic corrosion, same invisible resistance. The kind of tiny incremental environmental damage that built up slowly and silently over cold, wet days and nights in a compartment that wasn't sealed against long-term moisture exposure in a connection that had never been designed to handle the specific combination of temperature and humidity that the Alaskan site had delivered to all 6 aircraft equally simultaneously without mercy. Reynolds stood very still when Hayes confirmed the 6th aircraft. He was looking at Emily, and she was beginning to pack up her bag, moving efficiently and without theater the way she always worked. "You have the repair?" she asked. "Straight to swap on the connector," Donnelly said. Her voice had changed. The careful professional neutrality was gone. In its place was something much simpler, genuine. "We have the parts. We can have all 6 done in under an hour." Emily nodded. She picked up her bag. Reynolds took a step toward her. He had the look of a man who had a great many things he needed to say and wasn't sure which one to start with. "Carter," he said. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you know to look there?" She thought about it, not performing thought, actually thinking the way she always did before she answered a question that deserved a real answer. "I didn't know," she said. "I just started from a different place. You knew what the machines were saying. I was trying to figure out what they weren't saying, what was too quiet, what was missing." Reynolds looked at the helicopter. He looked at the small access panel on the first aircraft, still open, still showing that barely visible discoloration that had grounded 6 military aircraft for 72 hours and brought an operation to the edge of complete failure. "One connection," he said. "One connection," she agreed. He looked back at her. "My team has been at this for 3 days." She didn't say anything to that. There was nothing comfortable she could say, and she understood that he wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking at the truth of what had happened and working through what it meant. "We weren't looking in the right place," he said. Not to her specifically, more to himself, to the room, to the accumulated hours of effort and intelligence and expertise that had all been pointed precisely in the wrong direction. "We knew where to look. We looked there, and we were wrong." One of the younger technicians, Okafor, standing near the wall, the young man who had made the phone call that brought Emily here, let out a long, slow breath. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. The hangar was quiet in a completely different way now. Not the heavy quiet of defeat. Something else. Something that felt like the moment after a long storm breaks. Emily zipped up her bag. Donnelly was already moving to the parts cabinet. Hayes had his tools out. And on the wall above the hangar entrance, the clock ticked steadily forward, counting down the hours that remained before the deadline, in a race that 3 minutes ago had seemed completely impossible to win. 3 minutes. That was how long it had taken from the moment Emily stopped at the first access panel to the moment the entire team understood what they were dealing with. Not hours, not days, 3 minutes. And the strangest thing, the thing that would stay with Reynolds for a long time after this night was over, was not the solution itself. It was the fact that the solution had been there the entire time. Every single one of his technicians had walked past that access panel dozens of times over 3 days. They had checked it, cleared it, moved on. They had looked directly at the connection and seen nothing, not because they weren't skilled enough, not because they weren't smart enough, but because every single thing they had been trained to look for had told them there was nothing to find. And Emily Carter, with no diagnostic equipment and no advanced technology and no rank and no medal and no reason at all for anyone to have called her in the first place, had walked into the hangar and found it in the time it would have taken most people to make a second cup of coffee. She pulled her bag over her shoulder. "Carter," Reynolds said again. She stopped. "Thank you." She looked at him, and then quietly, with no performance and no ceremony, she simply said, "The aircraft were telling you, you just needed someone to listen in a different way." She walked toward the exit. Behind her, the sound of tools hitting metal began filling the hangar. Confident, purposeful, urgent, a team that had been in defeat 10 minutes ago and was now in motion again, with a direction and a deadline and a belief that had returned to them from a completely unexpected source. The clock on the wall read 4:42 in the morning. They had just over an hour before the storm system began its approach. And for the first time in 72 hours, Major Thomas Reynolds picked up his radio. "Hargreaves," he said, his voice steady and clear, and carrying the particular weight of a man who has been handed back something he had almost permanently lost. "Get Colonel Whitmore on the line. Tell him we found it." A pause on the other end. Then Hargreaves, in a voice that was unmistakably trying to stay professional. "Found it, sir." Reynolds looked at the first helicopter. Donnelly was already inside the access panel, her hands moving with the focused precision of someone who finally understood exactly what she was doing. Tell him we found it, Reynolds said, and tell him we needed help from someone who wasn't afraid to look where we didn't think to look. He set down the radio. He walked to the second helicopter. And he got to work. The first engine came back to life at 5:14 in the morning. It didn't roar. It didn't thunder. It started the way all engines start when they've been silent too long, with a low, uncertain cough, then a hesitation, then a slow build of power that climbed steadily until it settled into a rhythm that filled the entire hangar with something that felt to every person standing in that space less like a mechanical sound and more like a pulse, returning to a body that had been still for far too long. Donnelly stood back from the first helicopter and just listened. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there with grease on her hands and her eyes slightly red from 3 days without proper sleep. And she let the sound wash over her like something she had genuinely not been sure she was ever going to hear again. Hayes beside her put both hands on top of his head. Okafor across the hangar turned away for a moment. Nobody called him on it. Reynolds was on the radio before the second engine fired. Hargreaves, first aircraft is operational. Stand by. The second engine came up 4 minutes later, then the third, then in rapid succession, the fourth and the fifth, each one adding its voice to the growing sound inside the hangar, until the noise was so complete and so overwhelming that the technicians had to raise their voices just to talk to each other across short distances. The sixth engine took an extra 8 minutes. That was the one that had the worst corrosion on its connection. Not dramatically worse, but enough to require a second look at the replacement part, a rechecking of the torque on the new connector, a careful verification that the signal reading had come back up to full operational strength before anyone was willing to call it done. Hayes did that one himself. He went through every step twice. When the sixth engine finally fired, he stood up from the access panel slowly, with the careful movements of someone whose body had been under sustained stress for a very long time, and he just nodded once to nobody in particular. All six, 72 hours of failure, 37 minutes of repair. Reynolds radioed Whitmore at 5:51 in the morning. Colonel, all 6 aircraft are operational. The silence on the other end lasted almost 5 full seconds. In a military communication, 5 seconds of silence is a very long time. Then Whitmore said, "Say that again, Major." "All 6 aircraft are fully operational, sir. Ready for flight operations." Another pause. Shorter this time. "What was it?" Reynolds looked across the hangar. Emily Carter was gone. She had left quietly sometime during the repair process, without announcement, without ceremony, without waiting for anyone to tell her she had done something extraordinary. Her bag was gone. The space near the entrance where she had been standing was empty. "Corrosion on a secondary interface connection," Reynolds said. "Environmental, moisture exposure over sustained cold. All 6 aircraft. Same panel, same connection, same failure. Below diagnostic threshold." Whitmore was quiet again. "Who found it?" Reynolds paused for just a half second, not long enough for Whitmore to notice, but long enough for him to decide exactly how to answer. "A maintenance specialist from logistics, sir. Carter Emily. Specialist Okafor made the contact." "Get her name in the report," Whitmore said. "Full report on my desk by 0900. And Reynolds, sir, good work." The line went dead. Reynolds set down the radio. He stood in the middle of the hangar, surrounded by the sound of 6 functioning aircraft, and he thought about what Whitmore had just said. Good work. It was what commanders said when something went right. It was what you said to the people responsible. And Reynolds was standing in a hangar full of technicians who had worked themselves to near collapse over 3 days and had still not found the answer. And the answer had walked in through the door in the middle of the night, carrying a single bag, stayed for less than an hour, and walked out again before anyone thought to stop her. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. He just turned to his team and told them to begin pre-flight preparation, and they moved all of them with the focused energy of people who had been handed back their purpose after being afraid it was gone. But something stayed in the air of that hangar after Emily Carter left. Something that none of the technicians talked about directly, but that all of them felt. A question that didn't have an easy shape, but that sat in the quiet moments between tasks and refused to go away entirely. How had they missed it? That question was still sitting with Reynolds 3 hours later when Colonel Whitmore walked into his office. Whitmore didn't knock. He never knocked on his own subordinates' doors, not out of disrespect, but because he operated on the principle that a commander who knocked was a commander who was asking permission to enter a space he was responsible for, and that was a habit he had trained himself out of early in his career. He came through the door, set a coffee cup on the edge of Reynolds' desk, pulled a chair, and sat down. Reynolds looked up from the report he was writing. "Colonel?" "Sit," Whitmore said, though Reynolds was already sitting. Whitmore looked at him for a moment without speaking. This was another of Whitmore's habits. He was a man who gathered information before he used it, and he gathered it from people's faces as readily as from their words. What he saw in Reynolds' face right now was complicated relief fatigue, and underneath both of those something with a harder edge. "Talk to me," Whitmore said. "Not for the report, for me." Reynolds set his pen down. He leaned back in his chair. And for the first time since the crisis began, he allowed himself to drop the professional composure that had been holding him upright for 3 days. "I keep going back to it," he said. "That panel. We checked that panel. I checked it personally. Donnelly checked it. Hayes checked it. We ran the diagnostic. It came back clean. We moved on." "You moved on because the diagnostic told you to move on." "Right, and the diagnostic wasn't wrong technically. The system was still reading a signal. It just wasn't reading a signal strong enough to matter. But we built those diagnostics to detect failures above a certain threshold. In this," he stopped. He picked up his pen and set it back down. "This was just below that threshold, by a margin so small that if you didn't know exactly what you were looking for, you would never see it." Whitmore nodded slowly, and she knew what to look for. Reynolds shook his head. "That's the part I keep coming back to, sir. She told me she didn't know what she was looking for, not at the start. She said she started from a different place. She wasn't asking what failed. She was asking what wasn't being said." Whitmore was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slightly in his hands. "What does that mean to you?" "I think," Reynolds started, then stopped. He looked at the window for a moment, then back at the colonel. "I think we were trained to solve a specific category of problem. Internal mechanical failure, system malfunction, component breakdown, and we're very good at solving that category of problem. But this wasn't that category. This was environmental, incremental, something that accumulated over time in a way that didn't look like a failure from inside the system, because from inside the system, everything was still technically working. So the system couldn't see it. The system couldn't see it. And because we trusted the system, we couldn't see it either." Whitmore was quiet again. He drank his coffee. Outside somewhere across the base, the sound of aircraft engines filtered through the walls. The 6 helicopters in the air now, operational again, running the exercise that had been suspended for 3 days. The sound was ordinary. The sound was exactly what it should be. But in the context of everything that had happened to produce it, it felt like something else entirely. "What do you know about Carter?" Whitmore asked. Reynolds shook his head slightly. "Not much, sir. She's in logistics maintenance. She's been doing it for about 8 years as far as I can tell. Before this assignment, she was at a facility in Montana, a smaller post, older equipment, the kind of place where you don't get to replace parts when they fail. You fix them with whatever you have. You learn to work around limitations because you don't have the option of calling in backup systems." He paused. "I think that's part of it. She grew up technically in an environment where the equipment didn't have modern diagnostics, where you had to read the machine directly because there was nothing else to read. She read ours. She did. Even though our equipment is considerably more advanced than anything she would have worked with in Montana." Reynolds looked at him. "Maybe that's exactly why she could, sir. Maybe the advancement was the problem. We had so many systems telling us where to look that we stopped looking anywhere else." Whitmore let that sit for a moment. Then he stood up, picked up his coffee cup, and said, "I want her in a meeting this afternoon, 1400. Bring your key people. Donnelly, Hayes, Okafor." Reynolds blinked. "Sir, what she did this morning shouldn't stay in a maintenance report, Reynolds. What she did this morning's a lesson, and I want my people to hear it from her directly." He walked to the door. "And Reynolds," he stopped but didn't turn fully around, "the fact that it took 72 hours doesn't reflect badly on your team. I want you to know that. What it reflects is a gap in how we train, a gap we're going to close." He paused. "Get some sleep before 1400. He left. Reynolds sat alone in his office for a long moment after the door closed. Then he picked up his phone and dialed the number Okafor had given him. It rang 4 times. He was beginning to think she wouldn't answer when she picked up. Carter. Specialist Carter, this is Major Reynolds. A brief pause. Major, is there a problem with the aircraft? He almost laughed. After everything, her first thought was whether the aircraft were all right. No, all 6 are operational, flying the exercise as we speak. He cleared his throat. Colonel Whitmore has requested your presence at a meeting. 1400 hours, main conference room. He wants to discuss what happened last night and what it means for training protocols going forward. Another pause, longer this time. A meeting? Yes, with the colonel and my team leadership, Donnelly Hayes Okafor. He paused. I'd appreciate it if you came specialist. The silence on the line stretched just long enough to be interesting. All right, she said finally, I'll be there. She arrived at the conference room at 13:58 hours. 2 minutes early, she was dressed in standard work uniform, her maintenance bag not with her. This time she had understood or perhaps assumed that this was a different kind of work. She came through the door and found the room already occupied. Reynolds was at the head of the table. Donnelly and Hayes were to his left. Okafor was near the far end, the youngest person in the room by a visible margin. Colonel Whitmore was standing by the window. He turned when she entered. Specialist Carter. He crossed to her and extended his hand, and his handshake was firm and direct, and carried the full weight of a man who knew exactly how to communicate respect through the simple mechanics of a greeting. Thank you for coming. Of course, sir. She shook his hand. She was calm. Not performing calm, actually calm, the way people are calm when they're not thinking about how they look, but just about what they're doing. Whitmore gestured to a chair, and everyone sat. There was a moment of organizational quiet, the adjustment of chairs, the setting down of cups, the small physical arrangements that give people a moment to find their role in a space before the real conversation begins. Then Whitmore looked directly at Emily. I want to understand what happened last night, he said. Not the technical details, Reynolds' report covers those thoroughly. I want to understand how you thought, what you did, and why you did it in the order that you did it. Emily looked at him steadily. Sir, with respect, I'm not sure my process is as organized as that implies. Tell me what it is then. She thought for a moment. Not performing thought, genuinely organizing something that she had never been asked to put into words before because she had always just done it and moved on. When I walked into the hangar, she said, the first thing I noticed was that there were a lot of very smart, very experienced people standing very still. And in my experience, when smart people are standing still, it's usually because they've exhausted the options that their training tells them exist. They haven't run out of intelligence. They've run out of map. Donnelly shifted slightly in her seat. It wasn't an aggressive movement. It was the movement of someone hearing something that lands somewhere uncomfortable. So the first thing I did, Emily continued, was try not to use the same map. I didn't look at the diagnostic readouts. I deliberately didn't ask what the computer said because I already knew they weren't showing a critical failure. If they had been, your team would have found it in the first 6 hours. She paused. I started with what all 6 aircraft had in common, not internally, externally, because if all 6 failed the same way at the same time, the cause was either a shared component or a shared environment. And since you'd already checked every shared internal component, the environment was what was left, Hayes said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. The environment was what was left, Emily confirmed. So I started thinking about what that environment had done to these specific aircraft over the specific period of time they'd been sitting in that specific location. Cold, more. Temperature cycling. Those are processes. They happen slowly. They accumulate. And they don't tend to trip diagnostic thresholds because they're not events. They're gradual states. Whitmore leaned forward. And the connection specifically, that was the last step, sir. Once I knew I was looking for something environmental and gradual, I was looking for the most vulnerable point of interface between the external environment and the internal systems. Not a primary system, those are protected, but a secondary connection point. Something at the boundary, something with just enough exposure and just enough age to be susceptible. The access panel I checked was the lowest profile secondary interface on that aircraft. The most likely place for moisture to accumulate over time without triggering an internal alert. The room was quiet. Whitmore leaned back. He looked around the table at his people. Donnelly had her arms on the table in front of her, and she was looking at her hands. Hayes was looking at Emily with an expression that was thoughtful and serious. Reynolds was looking at the middle distance. Okafor was writing something down on a notepad. Major Reynolds told me, Whitmore said, that you said the aircraft were telling you what was wrong, that you weren't finding the problem, you were listening for it. Emily nodded slightly. That's probably a better way of saying it than how I actually said it. Explain it. She was quiet for a moment. Every piece of equipment I've ever worked on, and I've worked on equipment that was 30, 40 years old, equipment that didn't have digital readouts or alert systems or automatic diagnostics, every single piece of equipment communicates. It doesn't communicate in words. It communicates through what it does and what it doesn't do, through the gap between what it should be doing and what it's actually doing, between what the specifications say should be happening and what's actually happening in front of you. She paused. Modern diagnostics are extraordinary. They can detect failures that would have been invisible to engineers 20 years ago, but they're built to detect specific categories of failure. And when something happens outside those categories, something at the edge, something below the threshold, something that doesn't fit the defined failure modes, the diagnostic doesn't catch it. It says normal. And if you trust the diagnostic completely, you say normal too. And you keep looking inside the machine for something that's actually happening between the machine and the world it's sitting in. When Hayes spoke, we walked past that panel 60, 70 times over 3 days. I know, she said, not with any edge, just acknowledgement. We didn't see it. You weren't looking for something below the threshold. You had no reason to be. The system told you the signal was present, so the connection was clear. That was a reasonable conclusion to draw from the information available to you. But you looked. I looked because I didn't have the diagnostics conclusion in my head yet. I came in after the conclusion had already been drawn. So I had space to look at things you'd already moved past. Donnelly raised her head. She had been quiet this whole time, and when she spoke, her voice had a directness that felt less like confrontation and more like a person who had been working through something private and had finally arrived at the part she needed to say out loud. Specialist Carter, can I ask you something directly? Please. When you walked into that hangar and saw what we had done, how many people we had working, how long we'd been at it, what we'd already checked, did you think we were incompetent? The question landed in the room with a particular weight. Reynolds looked at Donnelly sharply, then back at Emily. Whitmore didn't move. Emily looked at Donnelly without looking away, and her answer came without any visible hesitation. No, she said. I thought you were exactly what you are, a very skilled team working from an extremely thorough protocol. And the protocol was right for the category of problem the system said you had. You weren't incompetent. The diagnostic was operating within its design, and you were operating within the diagnostic's conclusions. She paused. The gap isn't between skill and lack of skill. The gap is between what a system is designed to see and what it can't see. And nobody builds systems that can see everything. That's not possible. What's possible is being aware that the gap exists. Donnelly held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Short. It was enough. Whitmore stood up. Everyone else moved to stand, and he shook his head, stay seated, and walked to the window. Here's what I've decided, he said without turning around. I'm commissioning a new supplemental protocol for environmental and interface failure assessment. It will be added to standard procedure for all grounding situations that don't resolve within 12 hours of initial diagnostic. It will not replace the existing diagnostic process. It will accompany it. He turned around now. I want Reynolds' team to develop it with Specialist Carter as a primary consultant. Reynolds sat up slightly. Sir, Specialist Carter is assigned to... I know where she's assigned, Reynolds. I'm requesting a temporary secondment, 30 days. He looked at Emily. If that's agreeable, Specialist. Emily looked at him. She was very still for a moment, in the way that people are still when something unexpected has happened and they're running through the implications before they respond. Yes, sir, she said. That's agreeable. Good. Whitmore picked up his cap from the table and tucked it under his arm. The 6 aircraft are flying. The exercise is back on track. We have a storm system due in approximately 14 hours, and I want to make sure this operation finishes what it was supposed to do. He moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. He looked at Emily and his expression was not the formal command face of a colonel addressing a specialist. It was something more direct than that. You came in here in the middle of the night because a young specialist made a phone call. You found something the rest of us couldn't find, and you were packed up and leaving before anyone had a chance to tell you what it meant. He paused. Why bursting? Emily considered the question. The aircraft were fixed, sir. That was the job. You didn't want recognition. She thought about it. I didn't think about it one way or the other. The problem was interesting. I wanted to solve it. Once it was solved, there wasn't anything else to stay for. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, not exactly, but the expression of a man who has just confirmed something that he had already suspected was true. Write that in your report somewhere, Reynolds, he said. That exact answer. He left. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then Hayes exhaled through his teeth. Okafor clicked his pen. Reynolds looked at the table. Donnelly was looking at Emily. For what it's worth, Donnelly said. Her voice had lost its careful professional edge entirely. She sounded like herself, like a woman who had been awake for too long and had just moved through something significant and was coming out the other side of it with more respect for the world than she had going in. The way you came in there last night, no equipment, no attitude, she gestured with one hand, just looking. I've been doing this job for 16 years, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone work like that. Emily shook her head gently. You would have found it. Maybe, Donnelly said. Eventually, but not before Whitmore pulled the aircraft. She leaned forward slightly. You know that, right? We were 6 hours out. At the rate we were going, we were not going to find it. Emily didn't argue. Can I ask you something? Donnelly said. Sure. Where did you learn to look at things that way? That thing you described, the gap between what the system says and what's actually happening. Where does that come from? Emily was quiet for a moment. My first posting was a facility in rural Montana. Supply depot. Old equipment, skeleton crew, minimum budget. When something broke, you didn't get a technician flown in. You fixed it yourself or it stayed broken. And the equipment was old enough that half of it didn't have functioning diagnostics anymore. The readouts were wrong, the sensors were degraded, the alert systems hadn't been calibrated in years. She paused. So you learned to read the machine, not the machine's report on itself, the machine itself. You learned to feel what it was doing versus what it should be doing. Because that gap, that's where everything was. That's where every answer lived. Hayes leaned forward. And when you came somewhere like here, modern equipment, functioning diagnostics, full technical support, did it feel different? It felt easier in every way except one, she said. When the diagnostic works, you trust it, and trusting it is right most of the time. The diagnostic is right most of the time, but you start to forget how to read without it. You start to see the machine's report on itself instead of the machine. And occasionally, she stopped. Occasionally, the machine's report on itself is wrong, Reynolds said. It was the first time he'd spoken in a while. His voice was quiet and even, and there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not defeat, not bitterness, something more like the quality of a person who has just shifted the way they are standing and found that the new position is more stable, even if it took some discomfort to get there. Emily looked at him. Or the report is right but incomplete. There's a difference. Yes, Reynolds said, there is. He stood up from the table. The others followed. The meeting was over, not by announcement, but by the natural completion of something that had finished what it needed to finish. Chairs scraped back, cups were gathered, people moved toward the door with the particular low energy of people coming off sustained stress. Okafor was the last to stand. He stopped beside Emily as the others filed out. I'm sorry I woke you up, he said, in the middle of the night. She looked at him. You called the right person. I didn't know if you'd come. Of course I came. You told me 6 aircraft were down and nobody knew why. She paused. That's the most interesting problem I'd heard in months. He almost laughed. That's really all it was. It was interesting. She considered it. And it mattered. Both things. She picked up her bag. You asked the right question, Okafor. Back then on the drainage problem and last night on the phone. You asked why instead of what. That's where you find things. He nodded slowly. She walked toward the door. Specialist Carter, he said. She turned. I'm glad you picked up. She held his gaze for a moment. So am I, she said. She went through the door. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines moved overhead, 6 of them steady and purposeful, running the exercise that had been suspended for 3 full days. The sky above the base was clear for now. The storm was still 14 hours out. There was time. Inside the conference room, Reynolds stood alone for a moment. He walked to the window and looked out. He couldn't see the aircraft, they were too far out, but he could hear them. That specific harmonic of 6 military helicopters in formation. A sound that had been completely absent from this base for 72 hours and was now so present and so ordinary that you could almost forget it had ever been silent. Almost. I thought about Emily's answer to Whitmore's question. The aircraft was fixed. That was the job. He thought about the way she had packed up her tools and walked out of the hangar without waiting for anyone to notice, without staying long enough to collect whatever it was that most people stayed for, the recognition, the gratitude, the moment when the people who doubted you have to acknowledge that you were right and they were wrong. She had left without any of that. Because for her, none of that was the point. He thought about the young technicians on his team, Okafor, the newer specialists, the people who had been watching last night with wide eyes as she found in 1 hour what they had failed to find in 3 days. He thought about what that had looked like from their perspective, what it had taught them not in words, but in the irreducible reality of watching someone work. I thought about the panel, that small, unremarkable access panel on the lower fuselage of aircraft that cost millions of dollars and carried the weight of entire rescue operations. The gap between what the system reported and what was actually there. He thought about how many other times and how many other situations he might have trusted the report over the reality. How many times any of them might have. He turned away from the window and picked up his radio. Donnelly, sir, start pulling together framework for the supplemental protocol. I want an initial draft end of week. A pause. You want me to reach out to Carter? He looked at the door through which Emily had just left. She's going to be with us for 30 days, he said. We'll do it together. A beat of silence on the radio. Then Donnelly said, and there was something in her voice that he hadn't heard from her in a very long time, something that sounded remarkably like genuine enthusiasm. Understood, sir. I'll get started. He clipped the radio back to his belt. From somewhere across the base, the storm system's leading edge was beginning to show on the weather screens. 14 hours, possibly less, but the aircraft were flying, the mission was back on track, and for the first time in 3 days, the clock on the wall felt like an ally instead of an enemy. Everything had changed in a single night, not because someone had performed a miracle, not because of genius or technology or any resource that hadn't already been present in that hangar, but because one person had walked in and looked at the space between what the machines were saying and what they were actually doing. And in that space, that small, quiet, overlooked space, she had found everything. The storm hit early, not by much, 3 hours ahead of the forecast, which in any other context might have been a minor inconvenience. But 3 hours early on a base that was still running a critical exercise with 6 aircraft that had been grounded for 3 days and only returned to operational status the previous morning meant that 3 hours was exactly the difference between finishing and failing. The weather screens started showing the shift at Bureau 900. By 09:30, Reynolds had the alert on his radio. By 09:45, Whitmore had called an emergency operational meeting, and by the time everyone was in the room, the wind outside had already started changing pitch. Emily heard it from the corridor before she came through the door. She had spent the morning working at a temporary desk in the maintenance bay, beginning the early framework of what the supplemental protocol was going to look like. It was the kind of work like she was naturally suited for, not the performance of expertise, not the formal presentation of knowledge, but the quiet, methodical process of translating something she understood instinctively into language that other people could follow. She had been at it for 4 hours when Okafor appeared at the door of the maintenance bay with his jacket half on and an expression she had learned to read quickly over the past 18 hours. Meeting it, he said. Now, weather moved up. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. The conference room was already full when they arrived. Reynolds was standing at the front. Donnelly and Hayes were at the table. 3 pilots Emily hadn't met yet. Captain Sarah Voss, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, and Lieutenant Commander Paul Erickson were along the right side already in their flight gear, as though they had either just come in or were planning to go right back out. Whitmore was at the head of the table, And the expression on his face was the expression of a man calculating distances in his head that kept coming up short. Here's where we are, Whitmore said without preamble. The storm system has accelerated. We have a window of approximately 90 minutes before conditions exceed flight parameters for the exercise aircraft. The exercise is 70% complete. The final two phases involve search patterns over Sector 7, which is the farthest sector from the base and the most critical to the training objectives. He looked around the table. If we lose that window, the exercise is incomplete. We can't certify the unit. We restart in the spring, which pushes the operational deployment timeline by 4 months. No one spoke. Captain Voss. Whitmore looked at her. What do you need to complete both phases? Voss was a compact woman with a short dark hair and the specific manner of pilots who spend their professional lives making precise calculations about risk. She didn't hesitate. 68 minutes in Sector 7, minimum. That assumes we launch within the next 20 minutes. You have 20 minutes, Whitmore said. Voss stood up immediately and looked at Webb and Erickson. Let's go. They were moving before Whitmore finished the sentence. Then Hayes said, Sir, I need to flag something. Everyone stopped. Hayes had been looking at a tablet in his hand and his face had gone the particular shade of careful that Reynolds recognized from 3 days ago, the shade that meant Hayes had found something he wished he hadn't found and was now carrying the weight of having to say it out loud. What is it, Staff Sergeant? Whitmore's voice was even. Pre-flight check on aircraft 4 just came back. There's an anomalous reading on the engine 2 torque sensor. He looked up. It's minor, inside operational limits, but it's on the edge. The room went very quiet. Voss, who had been halfway to the door, turned around. How far inside? Reynolds asked. 12% margin, Hayes said. Flight manual specifies minimum 15. You said inside operational limits, Webb said. Inside the standard operational limit. The manual recommendation for extreme weather deployment is 15% or greater. Whitmore looked at Voss. Voss looked at the table for a moment, then at Whitmore. It's a recommendation, not a hard limit, sir. I know what it is, Captain. In normal conditions, 12% is fine. We've flown on less. This isn't normal conditions. Voss was quiet for a beat. No, sir, it isn't. The calculation was visible on everyone's face. 5 aircraft could attempt the exercise, but the Sector 7 search pattern was designed for 6. 5 aircraft in 68 minutes in Sector 7 during worsening conditions was a different risk profile than 6 aircraft in the same space. Not impossible, but different. Reynolds looked at Emily. She had been sitting near the door since they came in, slightly outside the main cluster of people around the table. Not excluded, just positioned the way she always positioned herself, at the edge of the space where she could see everything. She was looking at Hayes's tablet from across the room. Carter, Reynolds said. She looked up. The sensor reading, is that something you need to look at? She was already standing. Yes. Whitmore nodded once. You have 10 minutes. She and Hayes went out together at a pace that was not quite a run, but was everything short of it. Okafor followed without being asked. Aircraft 4 was in the second bay. The pre-flight crew had it fully powered and standing by, which meant all systems were live, and the anomalous reading was visible in real time on the onboard diagnostic. Emily went to the cockpit interface first, not to the engine itself, but to the readout. She stood in front of the screen for almost 90 seconds without touching anything. Hayes stood beside her. I know what you're thinking. Tell me. Same principle as last night. The diagnostic is reading something real. The question is whether it's reading it correctly. What's the history on this sensor? Hayes pulled up the maintenance log on his tablet. Last calibrated 11 months ago. Scheduled recalibration was supposed to happen during the exercise prep period, but it got pushed. Why? He looked at the log. Equipment backlog. The calibration unit was in use on another aircraft. Emily nodded slowly. She turned from the cockpit interface and moved around to the engine housing. She didn't open it. She put her hand against the exterior of the housing and held it there. Okafor watched her from a few feet away. He had seen her do this last night with the first helicopter, and he had thought it was strange then. Now watching her do it again, he realized it wasn't strange at all. She was feeling for vibration, for the specific quality of how the engine was running against what the sensor was reporting. It's smooth, she said. The sensor says otherwise, Hayes said. The sensor is misreading it, she said. The mount has micro vibration damage, not structural, but enough to cause the sensor to read low. The actual torque is within normal parameters, probably sitting at 18–19% margin. The sensor is reporting low because it's physically compromised, not because the engine is. Hayes stared at her. You're sure? Run a manual torque check, independent of the sensor. You'll see. Hayes was already moving. The manual torque check on a military aircraft engine was not a quick process, but Hayes had done it hundreds of times, and his hands moved with the specific efficiency of someone who has repeated a procedure enough times that his muscle memory is ahead of his conscious thought. He worked in silence for 4 minutes. Emily stood back and let him work. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Hayes stopped. He looked at his gauge. He looked at Emily. 18.7, he said. She had been right within 1%. Hayes exhaled through his nose. How did you from feeling the housing? The vibration quality of an engine running at healthy torque is different from one running low. Not dramatically, but if you've felt enough engines, you know the difference. She was already turning back toward the conference room. Tell Captain Voss she has 6 aircraft. She was moving before Hayes had finished putting his tools back. She came back through the conference room door at 9 minutes and 40 seconds, 20 seconds under Whitmore's deadline. Everyone was still at the table. Voss had her hand on her radio, ready to make the call to proceed with 5 aircraft. Sensor misread, Emily said. Mount vibration damage. Actual torque is 18.7%. Aircraft 4 is fully operational. The room absorbed that for about 2 seconds. Then Voss was on her radio. Crew, we go with 6, full complement, launch in 8. Whitmore looked at Emily. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then good catch. Hayes would have found it, she said. He was already thinking in the right direction. Maybe, Whitmore said, but Hayes had 4 minutes left on a 10-minute window. You gave him the answer in 9. She didn't respond to that. She sat back down near the door and picked up the notepad she had carried in from the maintenance bay. Whitmore watched her for a moment. Then he looked at Reynolds, and Reynolds looked back at him. And something passed between them, not words, not a signal, but the specific understanding of 2 people who have both just seen the same thing happen twice in less than 18 hours and are now both asking themselves the same quiet question about what that means. Outside, the wind was building. The launch sequence for 6 aircraft began at 10:21 hours. Emily listened to the engines fire from inside the conference room. She didn't go out to watch. She sat at the table with her notepad and kept working on the protocol framework because the aircraft launching was not her job anymore. Her job was the thing she was writing, the thing that would hopefully mean the next time an aircraft showed an anomalous reading, the team around it would have a better set of tools for knowing what to do with it. Donnelly came back into the conference room at 10:25 after the aircraft had cleared the field. She sat down across from Emily without being asked. Can I see what you have so far? She said, nodding at the notepad. Emily pushed it across the table. Donnelly read it in silence for about 3 minutes. Her expression moved through several things during those 3 minutes. Recognition, assessment, a few moments where she stopped and seemed to reread something, and then near the end, a look that Emily had seen before on the faces of people who read something that reordered how they were thinking about a familiar problem. This isn't just a checklist, Donnelly said. She looked up. No, Emily said. A checklist tells you what to look at. This is meant to tell you how to look. What questions to ask, how to think about the gap between what the system is reporting and what the machine is doing. It's almost more of a framework than a protocol. The protocol can come out of the framework, but without the framework, the protocol is just another set of boxes to check. Donnelly set the notepad down. Where did you learn to write like this, the thinking behind it? Emily shook her head. I didn't learn to write it, I learned to do it. Writing it is new. But you thought it all out this quickly. I've been thinking it for 8 years, Emily said. I just never had anyone ask me to put it down on paper. Donnelly was quiet for a moment, then, I owe you an apology. Emily looked at her. No, you don't. Last night when you walked in, you were protective of your team. That's not something you apologize for. I was dismissive, Donnelly said. Not because of anything you did, because of what I assumed about who you were before you did anything. She paused. Her voice was steady, but there was effort behind the steadiness. I've been on the receiving end of that before. I know what it feels like. And I did it anyway. I should have known better. Emily looked at her for a long moment. The things we know better are the hardest ones to live by under pressure, she said. That's true for all of us. Donnelly held her gaze. Then she reached across and picked up the notepad again. Let me help you finish this section. I know what information Reynolds is going to need to see in order to actually implement it. For the next 2 hours, they worked together at the table in the conference room, while the storm built outside and 6 aircraft ran their search patterns over Sector 7 in the tightening window. Emily wrote. Donnelly questioned. Emily revised. Donnelly suggested. It had the particular rhythm of two people who think differently enough to be useful to each other and similar enough to stay in the same current. At 11:47 hours, the radio on the table crackled. Voss's voice came through, and even through the static of a military radio during deteriorating weather, the quality of it was unmistakable. Base, this is Flight Lead. Phase 2 complete. All objectives met. We are RTB. Returning to base. Donnelly looked up from the notepad. Emily didn't look up, but something in her posture changed very slightly in the set of her shoulders, the way her breath moved. Something that was not quite a reaction, but was in the family of one. Reynolds came through the door 30 seconds later. He had his radio in his hand, and the look on his face was the look that people wear when relief is so large that it takes a few seconds to fully arrive. They got it, he said, unnecessarily. They had all heard, but he said it anyway because some things need to be said out loud, even when everyone already knows them. I heard, Emily said. She finished the sentence she was writing and put her pen down. Reynolds crossed to the table and looked at the notepad. He picked it up and read. He read longer than Donnelly had. He went back to certain sections. His expression changed while he read in ways that she had learned to pay attention to the small contractions around his eyes that meant something had surprised him, the slight forward lean that meant something had clicked. He put the notepad down. This is good, he said, and the way he said it, it was clear he didn't mean adequate. He meant something closer to necessary. Donnelly helped, Emily said. Reynolds looked at Donnelly. Donnelly shrugged in a way that meant yes, but also meant she wasn't going to make a production of it. I'm going to bring this to Whitmore this afternoon, Reynolds said. Before the debrief. I want him to see it before the team reconvenes. He paused. Both of you should be in that debrief. Donnelly said, of course. Emily said, all right. Reynolds looked at her for a moment. You know, last night I told Whitmore the answer was hidden in the smallest detail. She waited. I think I was wrong, he said. The detail wasn't small, it was exactly the right size. We just weren't looking at the right scale. She was quiet. There's a difference, he said, between something being hidden and something being invisible to the way you're looking. Yes, she said, there is. He nodded once. He picked up the notepad. He went to the door. He stopped. Carter, the protocol, when we implement it, and we will implement it, I'm going to put your name on it. She shook her head. Put the process on it. My name doesn't need to be there. The process came from somewhere, Reynolds said. People should know where. She didn't answer. He went out. Donnelly looked across the table at Emily. You're going to have to learn to accept credit, she said with a dryness that was warm rather than sharp. People who do things worth acknowledging don't get to decide whether they get acknowledged. Emily looked at her. I spent 8 years in Montana being the person who fixed things that didn't technically need to be fixed by someone with my classification level. I got good at not expecting acknowledgement. That was Montana, Donnelly said. This is Alaska, and it's different now. Emily looked at the notepad where it had been on the table, now gone with Reynolds. She thought about the 6 aircraft that had just landed. She thought about the exercise that was now complete. She thought about the sensor reading that morning, the 11 months of drift in an uncalibrated mount, the vibration quality of an engine at healthy torque that she had felt under her hand. She thought about the access panel the night before, the barely visible discoloration, the 3 days of extraordinary effort that hadn't been able to find it. She thought about what Reynolds had just said. Not small, the right size, just invisible to the scale they were working at. That was it, she thought. That was the whole thing. Not smarter, not more skilled, just working at a different scale, looking in the space between the systems instead of inside them. It had always been there. It was always going to be there. The question was always just who was going to look. The debrief was scheduled for 1400 hours in the main briefing room. By 1330, the word had spread across the base in the way that things spread on military installations, not through formal announcement, but through the specific osmosis of people who work in close quarters and talk to each other during the brief windows between tasks. The pilots had landed and been debriefed separately, and the word from that debrief had filtered out. The maintenance team's after action had started circulating. And somewhere in the mixing of these two streams of information, the story of the last 18 hours had begun to take on the shape that stories take when the people involved start telling them to each other. By the time the 1400 briefing began, every person in that room knew at least a version of what had happened. Not all the versions were accurate. Some of them had Emily Carter walking into the hangar and immediately pointing to the panel. Some had her arguing with Reynolds for hours before he listened. One version circulating among the newer enlisted had her saying something dramatic and declarative, a line, a quote, a moment that crystallized everything and made everyone realize at once that they had been wrong. None of those versions were true. The true version was quieter and harder to dramatize, and in some ways more remarkable for it. The true version was a woman who arrived without theater, moved slowly, asked questions that seemed sideways at first, and found the answer not by seeing something others had missed, but by looking from a position others hadn't occupied. The true version didn't have a dramatic line. It had a process, a way of thinking, and that was the version Reynolds told the room at 1400. He stood at the front of the briefing room with 60 people in seats in front of him. Technician, crew, support staff, some pilots still in their flight suits, and he told it plainly and completely. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't editorialize. He told them what had happened in order, including the parts that reflected on his team's limitations, including the 3 days of failed effort, including the moment when a specialist from logistics found what 12 experienced engineers couldn't. He told them about the diagnostic threshold, about the gap between what systems report and what they actually see, about the sensor that morning in the calibration drift and the vibration quality that Emily had felt under her hand. And then he said, "I want Specialist Carter to say something." Emily had been sitting in the second row. She had not expected to be called on. She had come to the debrief because Reynolds had asked her to, and because she understood that this was part of the work, not separate from it. But being called to the front of a room with 60 people looking at her was not something she had prepared for. She stood up. She walked to the front. She turned around and looked at the room. For a moment, she was quiet. Not from nerves. She wasn't nervous in the way most people mean when they say the word. She was quiet because she was thinking about what actually needed to be said versus what could be left out. Then she said, "I want to talk about what you trust." The room was still. Every system you work with is built to detect a specific set of failures. The people who built those systems were brilliant, and the systems work. They detect what they were designed to detect, and they detect it reliably and accurately. The problem isn't the system, she paused. The problem is when the system becomes the limit of what you look for, when you stop at the edge of what the diagnostic reports and don't ask what the diagnostic can't see. A young technician in the third row, a woman early 20s, the kind of intense stillness in her expression that meant she was recording everything, raised her hand. Emily looked at her. "Yeah. How do you know when the diagnostic is wrong?" "You don't always," Emily said. "Most of the time it's right. That's the point. It's right often enough that trusting it is rational. The question isn't when to stop trusting it. The question is what you do after you've trusted it and still don't have an answer." She looked at the room more broadly. If the system says no failure and the machine still isn't working, you don't have a wrong system. You have a failure the system wasn't built to see, and that's your starting point. Not the system's answer, the space after the system's answer. Reynolds watched the room. He watched the faces. He watched the young technician in the third row write something down quickly. He watched Hayes in the back nod once slowly. He watched Donnelly seated to his left with an expression he hadn't seen on her in years. Open, genuinely thinking, not defending or assessing, just thinking. He looked at Emily at the front of the room. I thought about the night she had arrived, the skepticism, the laughter when she said 9 minutes, the crossed arms, the careful professional neutrality that was actually very close to dismissive. I thought about where all of that had come from, not malice, not arrogance, just the accumulated weight of expertise and protocol and the deep human instinct to trust the system that had worked before because it had worked before. The instinct that said, we know what we're doing and what we're doing should be enough. And if it isn't enough, The answer must be somewhere we haven't looked yet inside the space we've already defined. And the answer had been outside that space the entire time. Emily was still talking. She had moved from the abstract to the specific, working through a series of examples, not from the last 18 hours, but from her 8 years in Montana case after case of machines that had communicated their problems clearly once she had learned to listen at the right frequency. She talked about an HVAC system in a depot that had been reported as functional by 3 separate diagnostic sweeps, while simultaneously causing condensation damage that was visible to anyone who looked at the ceiling in the right section of the building. She talked about a generator that had been replaced twice when the actual problem was in the external grounding connection. She talked about a vehicle that reported full fuel capacity while actually operating at 60% because of a float calibration issue caused by years of temperature cycling in a poorly insulated garage. Each example was specific. Each one landed. And with each one, Emily watched the room change. Watched the stillness shift from polite attention to something more active. Watched people lean forward. Watched expressions move from receptive to engaged to the specific look of people making connections between what they were hearing and situations they had encountered themselves, situations they now saw differently. At 14:48 hours, Colonel Whitmore stood up from the back of the room. Everyone looked at him. He looked at Emily. "Specialist Carter," he said, "I'm going to ask you one question in front of this room." She waited. "If you had to summarize what you've taught this unit in the last 18 hours, not the technical process, not the protocol, but the single most important thing, what would it be?" The room was completely silent. Emily thought about it. She genuinely thought about it the way she always did without performance. Then she said, "The machine is never lying to you. It's always telling the truth. The question is whether you're listening in the language it's speaking." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the room and said, "That goes in the training manual, word for word." He sat back down. The room exhaled. Reynolds picked up his clipboard. He had notes from the debrief action items for the supplemental protocol names of people he wanted to loop in over the coming weeks. He looked at the list and thought about how different it was from the list he'd had in his hands 72 hours ago. That other list, the one covered in check marks next to all the things that hadn't worked. Both lists were full of effort. Only one of them led somewhere. I thought about what Emily had said. The machine is never lying. It's always telling the truth. You just have to be listening in the right language. He looked across the briefing room to where she was now being approached by the young technician from the third row, the one who had been writing everything down. They were talking quietly, and the technician had her notebook out, and Emily was gesturing slightly with one hand, in the way she gestured when she was explaining something concrete, and the technician was nodding with the specific energy of someone for whom a door has just opened. Reynolds watched them. I thought about the 18 hours since Emily had walked through the hangar entrance, about the sensor that morning, about the framework she and Donnelly had written that afternoon, about the debrief, about 60 people sitting in a room being asked to reconsider the most fundamental assumption of their professional practice. All of it in 18 hours. From one person who had shown up with one bag and no rank and no title that made anyone in that room take her seriously. And somewhere in the building outside, away from the briefing room and the debriefs and the recognition, she hadn't stayed for the storm that had given them 3 hours less than they needed, was pushing across the Alaskan sky the same storm that had accelerated everything, tightened every margin, forced every decision faster than anyone wanted. The same storm that had, in a way that nobody planned and nobody could have engineered, created exactly the conditions under which the lesson had to be learned, not theoretically, but in real time with real stakes, with the specific urgency that turns knowledge into understanding. The aircraft were down now, secured, safely hangared ahead of the weather. The exercise was complete. The operation was certified. And in the third row of the briefing room, a young technician with a full notebook was talking to a maintenance specialist from logistics about the space between what systems say and what they see. Tomorrow, that technician would go back to her work, but she would go back different. And that, Reynolds thought, was how it actually happened. Not in the dramatic moment of discovery, not in the 9 minutes or the 18 hours or the sensor reading or the debrief. It happened in the conversation after, in the question asked, in the notebook filled, in the shift from trusting the system to trusting the system and asking what the system couldn't answer. That was where it lived. That was where it was going to stay. The storm lasted 31 hours. When it finally broke, the base emerged from it, the way places emerge from serious weather, quieter than before, slightly rearranged, carrying a stillness that felt less like peace and more like the absence of noise after a very long time of it. The aircraft were undamaged. The hangars had held. The exercise results had been transmitted to command the evening before the storm hit, certified and complete. And that certification, that single document that represented the difference between a successful operation and 4 months of lost time, had arrived at its destination before the weather made communication difficult. Everything had worked out, but the 31 hours of the storm, the enforced stillness of a base locked down against serious Alaskan weather, had given people something they hadn't had in the previous 72 hours of crisis and the 18 hours of resolution that followed it. It had given them time to think. Reynolds used his time to read. He read the full draft of the supplemental protocol that Emily and Donnelly had produced. He read it twice. Then he pulled out the maintenance reports from the previous 3 days and read those. Then he sat for a long time with both documents in front of him, the crisis report and the protocol that had come out of the crisis, and he thought about the distance between them. About what the first document represented, genuine, sustained, expert effort that had failed, and what the second document represented, which was the framework for why it had failed and how to prevent it from failing the same way again. They were both honest documents. That was what struck him most. The maintenance report didn't hide anything. His team had done exactly what they had been trained to do, and they had documented it accurately and completely. The failure wasn't in the effort or the documentation. The failure was in the frame, in the invisible assumption that the diagnostic defined the search space and that if the diagnostic came back clean, the problem had to be somewhere the diagnostic was pointing. On the second morning after the storm, Reynolds called a team meeting that hadn't been scheduled. No agenda, no formal purpose, just the core team in the maintenance bay at 0800 with coffee and the kind of frank conversation that in Reynolds' experience only happened in the specific window after a significant event before the institutional memory of it started smoothing the hard edges. Donnelly arrived first, then Hayes, then 4 of the junior technicians, including a young woman named Specialist Renee Alvarez, the one who had been in the third row at the debrief, the one with the notebook, the one who had talked with Emily afterward. She came in with her notebook again, and Reynolds noticed it without saying anything. Okafor came in last, carrying 2 extra cups of coffee. He handed one to Alvarez without being asked. She took it without looking up from her notebook. "Here's what I wanted to do this morning," Reynolds said. He was standing, not sitting, not because he was making a formal presentation, but because he'd found over the years that he thought better on his feet. "I want to go through the last 4 days in order, not the technical sequence, the decision sequence, every point where we made a choice about what to look at next and why." He looked around the room. "Nobody's in trouble. Nothing said in this room goes in any report. I want to understand what we were thinking, not what we were doing." A brief silence. Then Hayes said, "We were thinking what the diagnostic told us to think." "Expand on that." Hayes set his cup down. "First 4 hours, we ran the standard protocol. That's what you do. That's what we're trained to do. Protocol came back clean, so we moved to secondary systems. Protocol came back clean, so we moved to tertiary, clean, at which point..." He stopped. He picked up his cup again. "At which point the protocol didn't have a next step. We'd followed it to the end. And when you follow the protocol to the end and it hasn't given you an answer, you either go back to the beginning and run it again, or you start improvising." "And we went back to the beginning," Donnelly said. "Twice," Hayes confirmed. 3 times on some systems. "Because we trusted the process," Donnelly said. It was not a criticism. It was just a fact stated plainly. Alvarez up from her notebook. "Can I ask something?" Reynolds looked at her. "That's why we're here." At any point in those 72 hours before Specialist Carter arrived, did anyone think to ask why all 6 aircraft failed the same way? Not how to fix each individual aircraft, but why all 6? The room was quiet. Reynolds looked at Donnelly. Donnelly looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at the table. "Note," Reynolds said, because it was true and the room needed to hear it said out loud. "We were in individual aircraft mode. Each helicopter was a separate problem. We were moving from one to the next, looking for the specific failure in each system. And when we found the same clean diagnostic on each one, we treated that as a coincidence of timing rather than a common cause. Alvarez wrote something in her notebook. That's the thing she changed, Okafor said. His voice was quiet. He had been listening more than speaking, which was how he usually operated, and when he spoke, it had the weight of someone who had been sitting with something for a while. Specialist Carter, the first thing she did, she didn't go to any individual aircraft. She stepped back and looked at all six together. She was looking for the pattern before she looked for the part. Reynolds stared at him. It was such a precise articulation of what had actually happened that for a moment he couldn't say anything. Pattern before part, he said. Okafor nodded. Donnelly had her elbows on the table. We're trained to look for the part, she said. That's the diagnostic model. Something is broken. Find which part, replace or repair it. That model works for 95% of the failures we encounter. And the other 5%, Alvarez asked. The other 5% are either random coincidences or common cause failures, Donnelly said. Random coincidences you treat individually, but common cause failures. You have to step back far enough to see that they're common, Hayes finished. And we didn't step back, Reynolds said. Not with bitterness, just with the directness of a man who had decided the only useful thing to do with an error was to understand it clearly. We were too close, too focused on each tree to see that all six trees had the same root problem. Alvarez looked up. So how do we build that in? How do we make stepping back part of the protocol instead of something that depends on having someone like Specialist Carter walk in from outside? Reynolds picked up the folder in front of him and slid it across the table toward her. That's what this is, She opened it. It was a printed copy of the supplemental protocol still in draft form, Emily and Donnelly's handwriting visible in the margins from the working session 2 days ago. Alvarez read the first page. She read slowly, then she turned to the second page. And Reynolds watched her read it the same way he had read it, with the specific quality of attention that meant something was connecting, clicking into place, fitting into a space in her understanding that had been empty. She thought of everything, Alvarez said. It wasn't rhetorical. It was almost a question. She thought of the framework, Donnelly said. The specific technical content will build out from here, but the structure, the way of thinking, that's hers. Alvarez put the document down. She looked at Reynolds. Major, is she still here, Specialist Carter? She's here for 30 days. Can we work with her directly, not in formal meetings? Just work with her. Let her look over our shoulders and tell us when we're making the wrong kind of assumption. Reynolds looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Donnelly. Donnelly said, I'll ask her. The answer when Donnelly asked her was yes, of course yes, because Emily Carter had never been someone who withheld what she knew from people who wanted to learn it. That was one of the things that the Montana posting had given her, 8 years of being the person in the room who knew how to do something that nobody else knew how to do, and learning slowly and through repetition that the most useful thing you could do with knowledge was share it in a way that stayed after you left. She started working with the junior technicians the following morning. It was not structured. There was no curriculum, no formal lesson plan, no scheduled blocks of instruction time. She simply showed up in the maintenance bay when she was working on the protocol documentation and made herself available, and the technicians who wanted to learn found their way to her in the spaces between their other work. Alvarez was always there. 2 other junior specialists, Marcus Tran and specialist Joanna Pierce, became regulars. Okafor came when he could, which was often. What Emily did with them was simple in concept and difficult in execution. She took them back to things they already knew and asked them to explain why. Not what they all knew what, but why this component failed in this way, why this system responded to this condition, why the diagnostic was calibrated to this threshold rather than a different one, why under what assumptions with what limitations. She made them think about the frame. Tran described it afterward as feeling like someone turned the lights on in a room you thought you already knew. Alvarez described it as realizing that knowing a procedure and understanding it were 2 entirely different things, and that she had spent her career doing the first without fully doing the second. Pierce, the quietest of the group, said simply, I'll never look at a diagnostic readout the same way. Reynolds heard all 3 descriptions through Donnelly, who reported them with a tone that mixed professional assessment with something warmer. He thought about what it meant that three people young, skilled, genuinely good at their jobs had been changed this significantly in less than a week by one person who had shown up in the middle of the night with one bag. He thought about what it meant for the 140 other people on this base who hadn't had that same access. I was thinking about that on the sixth day after the crisis, 12 days into Emily's 30-day secondment when he was called to Whitmore's office. The colonel was standing when Reynolds arrived, which was unusual. Whitmore was a man who conducted most of his conversations from a seated position, partly by habit and partly because he had found over the years that a commander who sat was a commander who was signaling he had time for a real conversation rather than a brief directive. Standing meant something different. "Sit down, Reynolds," Whitmore said. Reynolds sat. Whitmore remained standing. He had a folder in his hand, physical paper, which also meant something. Whitmore had gone almost entirely digital 2 years ago. He only used physical paper for documents that he wanted to handle slowly, to read in sequence, to hold. "I received something from command this morning," Whitmore said. "It arrived before I was at my desk. By the time I got in at 0630, there were already 3 separate communications from 3 different people about it." Reynolds waited. Whitmore opened the folder and set it on the desk facing Reynolds. It was a single page. At the top was the crest of the Air Force Materiel Command. Below it was a memo, 3 paragraphs, clean and formal. Reynolds read the first paragraph. He read it again. "They want to implement the protocol base-wide," he said. "Across 7 installations," Whitmore confirmed. "Alaska, Montana, Washington State, 2 in the Pacific Theater, 1 in Europe." Reynolds looked up. "How did they even know about it?" "We submitted the exercise report, but the supplemental protocol documentation isn't finalized yet. I submitted an executive summary to command the morning after the debrief." Whitmore sat down now. His voice was measured and direct. "I've been doing this for 28 years, Reynolds. When something happens that matters, you don't wait for the formal process to catch up to it. You put it in front of the people who can act on it immediately, and you let the formal process follow." Reynolds looked at the memo again. This is a significant implementation." "It is. The protocol isn't complete. We still have 2 sections that Specialist Carter and Donnelly haven't finished." "I know. Command knows. The memo authorizes us to continue development and submit the final version within 60 days. The base-wide implementation will roll out in phases, starting with the final version." Whitmore paused. "They also want Specialist Carter named as primary developer in the official documentation." Reynolds sat with that for a moment. "She won't like that," he said. "She doesn't have to like it. It's accurate." Whitmore looked at him steadily. "She found something in one night that changed the way we're going to train maintenance crews across 7 installations. Her name goes on it. That is not a negotiation." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. There's one more thing." Reynolds waited. "Command wants to know about Specialist Carter's career trajectory, her current classification, her posting history, her performance record." Whitmore held his gaze. "They're asking because they're considering whether her current role reflects her actual capability." The room was very quiet. Reynolds understood exactly what that meant. He had understood somewhere in the back of his mind since the morning Emily had found the sensor misread in 9 minutes that this was a possibility. That the world outside this base was eventually going to notice that a maintenance specialist from logistics had developed a protocol that 7 Air Force installations were about to implement. That someone somewhere up the chain was going to ask the question that common sense demanded. "Why is she a logistics specialist?" "What should I tell them?" Whitmore asked. Reynolds looked at the window for a moment. He thought about Emily in the maintenance bay sitting with Alvarez and the others, not because anyone told her to, but because she found it worthwhile. He thought about her walking out of the hangar in the middle of the night without waiting for anyone to acknowledge what she'd done. He thought about her answer to Whitmore's question at the debrief meeting. The aircraft was fixed. That was the job. I thought about the notebook on his desk, the one Emily had left with him 2 days earlier after a working session on the protocol. She had set it down without saying anything, and when he had opened it later, he had found 8 years of notes. Not formal documentation, personal notes in her handwriting, covering the margins, in every page observations and questions and connections, spanning the entire span of her time in Montana and after. It was the record of a mind that had been working continuously on a problem that nobody had given her formal permission to work on. A mind that had been documenting what the machine said, what the diagnostic said, and the space between those 2 things for nearly a decade, because she couldn't stop herself from thinking about it even when no one was asking her to. Tell them, Reynolds said, that her current role does not reflect her capability and that it hasn't for a long time. Whitmore looked at him. Tell them she should have been somewhere like here years ago, Reynolds said, and that we're fortunate she's here now, and that whatever decision they make about her trajectory, they should make it based on what she's capable of, not what category she was placed in 8 years ago by someone who didn't have the information we have. A pause. I'll pass that along, Whitmore said. He passed it along that afternoon. The response came back within 24 hours, which in Reynolds' experience of military communication was practically instantaneous, a signal if he needed one of how seriously the matter was being taken. Emily didn't know any of this. She was in the maintenance bay working. She had been told that the protocol was being submitted to command as part of the exercise after action package, which was true. She had not been told about the 7 installation implementation plan. She had not been told about the career trajectory inquiry. She was sitting with the protocol document and Donnelly's red pen edits and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. And she was working through Section 4 of the supplemental framework with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has decided this particular thing matters enough to do it correctly. Donnelly came in at 1600 and sat across from her. Emily looked up. Donnelly's expression was doing something complicated. What? Emily said. It wasn't a question. Donnelly put both hands flat on the table. The protocol is being implemented across 7 installations. Emily looked at her. Command memo. Came in this morning. Reynolds was with Whitmore about it 2 hours ago. Donnelly paused. I'm telling you before Reynolds does, because I think you need a minute to hear it somewhere that isn't someone's office with rank in the room. Emily was very still. 7 installations, she said. Alaska, Montana, Washington State, 2 Pacific, 1 Europe. Emily looked at the document in front of her. Section 4, the part she was in the middle of, the part she hadn't finished yet. The final version is due in 60 days, Donnelly said. We have time. It's not finished, Emily said. Her voice was even, not upset, processing. I know, they know. They were implementing in phases. Final version first, then the rollout. Donnelly watched her. You need to say something, Emily. It was the first time Donnelly had used her first name. Either of them had noticed without either of them acknowledging it. Emily looked up from the document. I don't know what to say. Try the first thing that comes to your head. Emily was quiet for a moment, then, I keep thinking about the Montana posting. About all the times something was wrong with a machine and I figured out what it was, and then I wrote it down in a notebook because there was nobody to tell. Because telling people things wasn't part of my job description. Fixing things was. She paused. I have 8 years of notebooks. Donnelly didn't say anything. And the answers were all in there, Emily said. The pattern before the part. The gap between the system and the machine. All of it. I had worked it out. She stopped. There was nobody to give it to. There is now, Donnelly said. Emily looked at her for a long moment. Your name is going on the protocol, Donnelly said. Command is insisting. That isn't changing regardless of what you say about it. Emily looked back at the document. And there's something else, Donnelly said. Her voice had shifted slightly. Still direct but careful now in a different way, the way you're careful when you're carrying something fragile. Command is looking at your career trajectory, where you're classified, where you've been posted, whether your current role reflects your actual capability. Emily said nothing. Reynolds told Whitmore that it doesn't, Donnelly said, that it hasn't for a long time. She paused. I don't know what that means practically. I don't have any details, but I think you should know it's happening. The maintenance bay was quiet. From somewhere on the other side of the building, very faintly came the sound of a helicopter, just one this time. A routine flight, the ordinary sound of aircraft doing what they were built to do. Emily listened to it for a moment. I came here to fix 6 helicopters, she said. I know. I've been here less than 2 weeks. I know. Emily looked at Section 4 of the supplemental protocol, the half-finished paragraph. The margin notes in Donnelly's red pen and her own. The document that was going to go to 7 installations and sit in maintenance bays across Alaska and Montana and the Pacific in Europe and get read by technicians who would never know the name of the person who wrote it, except now they would. She picked up her pen. Then let's finish it, she said. Donnelly looked at her. The protocol, Emily said. Let's finish section 4. She found the paragraph and set her pen to the page. If it's going to 7 installations, it needs to be right. Donnelly pulled her chair around to the same side of the table. They worked until 19:30 that evening. By the time they stopped, section 4 was done, and section 5 was half drafted. The coffee was cold. The maintenance bay was otherwise empty. Outside, the Alaskan dark had settled in fully, the after-storm sky clear and deep and very cold. Donnelly looked at what they had produced and said, "This is genuinely good." Emily looked at it too. "We'll see when Hayes reads it tomorrow. He'll find the holes." "He always does," Donnelly agreed. She gathered her papers. She stood up and put on her jacket. "For what it's worth," she said, pausing near the door. "I've been doing this job for 16 years. I've worked with a lot of brilliant people, people with more rank, more credentials, more formal recognition than you have." She held Emily's gaze. "I've never seen anyone think the way you think." Emily didn't look away. "That's because I had to," she said. "When you don't have the tools everyone else has, you develop different ones." Donnelly was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," she said, "but most people don't. Most people find a workaround and call it good. You went all the way through to the other side." She opened the door. "Get some sleep, Emily. Tomorrow's going to be a full day." She went out. Emily sat alone in the maintenance bay for a few minutes longer. The document was in front of her, section 5 half done, 7 installations waiting. She thought about Montana, about the notebooks, about the machines that had talked to her for 8 years in a language that nobody else in those facilities had thought to learn. She thought about the night she'd walked into the hangar and everyone had laughed when she said 9 minutes. She thought about the young technician in the 3rd row. Alvarez, the notebook, the question she had asked, "How do you know when the diagnostic is wrong?" She thought about her answer. "You don't always." But when the system has given you its answer and the machine still isn't working, you don't have a failed system. You have a failure the system wasn't built to see. She pulled section 5 toward her and kept writing. The protocol was submitted on day 23 of Emily's 30-day secondment. Not day 60, day 23. Reynolds sent it to command on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks ahead of the deadline, because Emily and Donnelly had finished it the previous Friday, and he had spent the weekend reading it 3 times and had run out of reasons to wait. It was complete. It was thorough. It was the kind of document that only gets produced when 2 people who think about problems completely differently sit down together and refuse to let the other one's blind spots slide. He submitted it at 0814. By 1100, he had a confirmation receipt. By 1400, he had a response that was 3 paragraphs long and contained a single sentence in the second paragraph that made him sit back in his chair and read it twice. The sentence said, "This document represents the most substantive contribution to environmental and interface failure assessment methodology that this command has received in the past 11 years. He called Whitmore. Whitmore read the message and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Get Carter in here." Emily arrived at Whitmore's office at 14:30. She was still in her work clothes. She had been in the maintenance bay when Okafor came to find her, and she had come directly, which meant she arrived with grease on one hand and her hair pulled back, and the look of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of a thought rather than prepared for a meeting. Whitmore showed her the response. She read it. She read it again. Then she looked up and said 11 years. That's what it says. What was the contribution 11 years ago? Whitmore blinked. Of all the responses he had anticipated, that was not one of them. "I don't know," he said. "I'd like to find out," she said. "If it's been the standard for 11 years, I want to know where our framework diverges from it. There may be things in that older document that we should have included." Reynolds, standing near the door, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man who had been surprised in a way he was no longer surprised to be surprised. Whitmore looked at Emily for a long moment. The afternoon light from the window was steady and clear. The Alaskan sky had been cleaned since the storm passed, cold and precise in the way it handled light. He had been a military commander for 28 years. He had sat across from general senators, foreign officers, engineers, who had built systems that the Air Force depended on. He had learned to read people quickly and accurately, which was one of the skills that had gotten him where he was. What he read in Emily Carter Howe at 14:32 on a Tuesday afternoon with grease on her right hand and genuine curiosity about an 11-year-old document on her face was the thing that distinguished the truly exceptional from everyone else. Not brilliance, not skill, not even dedication. It was the complete absence of the need to be finished. Most people, upon learning that their work had just been called the most significant contribution of its kind in over a decade, would stop. They would absorb that. They would let it be what it was. They would accept the endpoint. Emily Carter's first instinct was to find the gap. "I'll pull the older document," Whitmore said. "Reynolds, get it for her." "Yes, sir." Whitmore stood. "Specialist Carter, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it completely, not just the surface of it." She looked at him. "Command has formally requested that your classification and posting be reviewed," he said. "That process has been initiated. I don't control the timeline or the outcome, but I want you to know it is happening, and it was initiated at my recommendation." He paused. "What you've done here in 23 days represents a body of work that most people with 10 times your official credentials would not have produced. That needs to be reflected in where you are and what you're doing." Emily was quiet for a moment. "With respect, sir, I'm not sure my classification is the thing that needs changing." He waited. "I've been thinking about this," she said, "since Donnelly told me about the career trajectory inquiry, and I think the real problem isn't where I'm classified. It's that the system that classified me didn't have a way to recognize what I was doing, because what I was doing didn't fit an existing category." She paused. "Changing my classification puts me in a different box, but it doesn't change the box problem. There are other people in Montana right now, in facilities like the one I came from, doing work that doesn't fit any category, writing things in notebooks that nobody is asking to see." The room was very quiet. "And those notebooks are full," she said. Whitmore looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down, specialist." She sat, he sat, and they talked for the next 2 hours, not commander to specialist, not formally, but as two people who had both just recognized that the conversation they were having was larger than either of them had walked into the room expecting. Reynolds left partway through to give them space and stood in the corridor outside Whitmore's office for a few minutes, not going anywhere, just standing. He could hear the murmur of conversation through the door. Not the words, just the rhythm of it, the back and forth of two people working something out together that neither of them had fully worked out before they started. He thought about what Emily had said. Other people in Montana right now. Other notebooks. I thought about the 8 years she had spent in a facility where the equipment didn't have functioning diagnostics and nobody was asking her to develop alternative methods. And she had developed them anyway in a notebook because she couldn't stop thinking about the problem even when the problem wasn't officially hers to solve. I thought about how many times that had happened in facilities across the military. How many people right now were solving problems in ways that didn't fit any existing category, writing things down in margins that nobody was collecting, developing frameworks that were staying local, because the system that would recognize their value hadn't been built yet. He thought about what it would mean to build it. He went back to his office. He sat down. He picked up a pen, and he started writing not a protocol this time, not a technical document, but a memo. A memo to Whitmore proposing something he hadn't thought to propose until 30 seconds ago, which meant it had been building in him for 23 days and had finally found its moment. He wrote for an hour. When Emily came out of Whitmore's office at 16:45, she walked past Reynolds' door, saw it was open, and stopped. He looked up. "How did it go?" he asked. She leaned against the door frame. She looked the way she always looked when she had been genuinely thinking for an extended period, slightly more still than usual, as though some external surface layer had been worn away. "He wants to propose something to command, a broader initiative, something about collecting and formalizing informal methods from lower classified posts." Reynolds looked at her steadily. "The notebooks." She blinked. "You knew I came to the same place you did," he said, "about 5 minutes after you said it in his office. I've been writing a memo about it." She looked at the paper on his desk. She crossed the room and he turned it so she could read it. She read for about 3 minutes. "You started with the Montana facility specifically," she said, "because you came from there, because I know it's not the only one. There are at least 12 like it," she said, "that I know of personally. Smaller posts, legacy equipment, small crews." She looked at him. "Those facilities have been running on informal knowledge for decades. Knowledge that exists because someone figured it out and told someone else, and that person told someone else. It's never been written, never been systematized, never been part of any official training." "But it works," Reynolds said. Most of the time it works, she said, and when it doesn't, nobody outside the facility knows why. And nobody outside the facility has the tools to fix it. He looked at his memo. She looked at his memo. They were both looking at the same document and thinking about the same thing, which was not the document itself, but the distance between what the document said and what it would take to make it real. This is going to be complicated to implement, she said. Most things worth doing are. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something she had not said to anyone in 23 days, which was, I don't know if I'm the right person to be involved in this. Reynolds looked at her directly. Why don't I? Because I understand the informal side, the notebook side. I don't understand the institutional side, how command works, how you get things implemented across installations, I don't know the language of the larger system. You understood an aircraft system you'd never worked on before, Reynolds said. In the dark, in the middle of the night. She looked at him. You looked at what the system couldn't tell you, and you found the answer in the gap, he said. This is the same problem. Different system, same gap. He paused. And you won't be doing it alone. She held his gaze for a long moment. The memo needs a second name on it, he said. If that's all right with you. She was quiet. Then it needs Donnelly's name too. She understood the institutional side before I did. She built the bridge between what I was doing and what you could use. Reynolds nodded. 3 names then. 4, Emily said. Okafor made the call. Without that call, none of this happens. She paused. He asked the right question. He should be in the room when the answer gets built. Reynolds looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the memo and wrote 3 more names in the margin. The next morning at 0800, Whitmore received 2 documents simultaneously, his own draft proposal and Reynolds' memo, which had arrived via different routes but had landed on his desk within 4 minutes of each other and said in the specific language of their respective authors essentially the same thing. He read them both. He put them side by side. He sat back in his chair. Then he called his adjutant and said, get me the direct line for the Air Force Materiel Command Policy Office. Not the general line, direct. His adjutant came back 7 minutes later with a name and a number. Whitmore called. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. He didn't tell Reynolds or Emily about the call until 3 days later, when the response came back, and it was not the response anyone had expected. Command didn't want a proposal, they wanted a working group. Not a committee. Whitmore was careful to make that distinction when he told Reynolds because he knew Reynolds and committees, and the expression that crossed Reynolds' face when he heard the word working group was already skeptical enough. A working group, 8 people, representatives from 3 different commands. A mandate to develop a formal initiative for identifying, collecting, and systematizing informal technical knowledge from lower classified posts across the service. A 12-month timeline, based at this installation for the first 6 months, with Emily Carter named as lead technical advisor. Reynolds read the document that Whitmore handed him. He read the specific language of the mandate. He looked at Emily's name in the 3rd paragraph with the title beside it that she had never held before. He looked up. Whitmore was watching him. Your reaction? Honestly, sir? He looked at the document again. I'm trying to decide if it's fast enough. Whitmore almost smiled. Tell her before she hears it from someone else. Reynolds found her in the maintenance bay. She was working with Alvarez on the final review of the protocol's appendices, the detailed technical sections that had to be precise enough to be operationally useful, but accessible enough to be understood by technicians who weren't going to have Emily sitting next to them when they read it. It was careful, painstaking work, and they were both deep in it when Reynolds came through the door. Alvarez looked up. Emily didn't. She was mid-sentence on a correction, and she finished it before she acknowledged him, which was exactly the kind of thing that Reynolds had stopped finding surprising about her around day 4. Then she looked up. He handed her the document. She read it. He watched her read it the same way he had watched her read the response from command. The same careful attention. The same stillness that wasn't distance but concentration. When she got to the 3rd paragraph, something moved across her face, not shock, not excitement, something quieter and less named than either of those. She finished reading. She set the document down on the table. Alvarez was looking at her. What is it? Emily looked at the document for another moment. Then she looked at Reynolds. The notebooks, she said. The notebooks, he confirmed. Alvarez looked between them, not understanding the specific reference, but understanding the weight of it clearly enough to stay quiet. Emily picked the document back up and read the third paragraph again. Reynolds watched her. He thought about the first night she'd arrived, the clipboard he'd handed her. Her first question, not what failed, but what did the system tell you? He thought about the 9 minutes. He thought about Hayes at the sensor housing reading, 18.7. He thought about Donnelly at the conference room table, her hands flat, saying, I owe you an apology. I thought about Okafor with his phone already out before Reynolds finished saying, make the call. I thought about all the things that had to happen in exactly the right sequence for this document to exist. 12 months, and she said, first 6 here, second 6 mobile. You'll go to the installations, see the facilities yourself. She looked up. Montana? Montana first, he said. Your idea. She was quiet for a long moment. Alvarez said very carefully, Specialist Carter. What's happening? Emily looked at her. Then she turned the document around and pushed it across the table. Alvarez, read it. She read slowly. She read the third paragraph and her expression shifted so completely and so quickly that she made no effort to manage it. Surprise, recognition, and something that looked very much like the particular emotion that occurs when you realize that something you hoped was true has turned out to actually be true. Lead technical advisor, Alvarez said. Yes, Emily said, for a 12-month working group. Yes. Alvarez set the document down. She looked at Emily the way the young technician had been looking at her since the night of the debrief, with the specific quality of attention that is not admiration exactly, but is the thing that generates it, which is genuine recognition of something real. I want to be part of it, Alvarez said. Whatever the working group needs, whatever I can do. Emily looked at her. I know, she said. You're already on the list. Alvarez blinked. I'm on the list. You already submitted a list. Last night, Emily said, after Reynolds told me the call to command was going in. I didn't know what the response was going to be, but I figured if it was going to be anything useful, it was going to need people who could work in the gap. She paused. You work in the gap. Alvarez was quiet for a moment. Then she said, how did you know it would go this way? Emily shook her head. I didn't. I never know how things are going to go. I just know what needs to happen, and I start building it before the decision comes back. Because if you wait for permission to prepare, you waste the first month of whatever you're going to do. Reynolds listened to that. He thought about it for a long time afterward. The formal launch of the working group was set for day 31. One day after Emily's secondment was officially supposed to end. The timing was Whitmore's deliberate and characteristically efficient. The secondment would conclude and immediately transition into the new role with no gap, no administrative limbo, no period of unclear status. On day 29, Reynolds asked Emily to come to the hangar, not for a meeting, not for a technical purpose, just to come. She arrived at 1900, which was after most of the base had wound down for the evening. The hangar was quiet. The 6 aircraft were there, the same 6 aircraft. All operational, all in their positions, all exactly where they had been 30 days ago when everything had been wrong with them and nobody could explain why. They stood near the first helicopter, the one with the access panel, the one she had gone to first. Reynolds didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the aircraft. I come in here sometimes, he said, since everything happened. I stand here and I look at it. She waited. I've been doing this for 20 years, he said. I thought I understood what it meant to look at a machine, to read a system, to find a failure. He paused. I didn't understand what I didn't understand. That's the part that stays with me. Emily looked at the access panel on the lower fuselage. Still the same panel, still the same location. If you knew what you were looking for, you could crouch down and look inside and probably still see the faint ghost of where the corrosion had been before the connector was replaced. And the problem that had grounded 6 aircraft for 72 hours was resolved in 37 minutes. Does it bother you? She asked. Knowing that, I thought about it honestly. It did at first. For about the first 2 days, it bothered me a great deal because I kept thinking about all the situations before this one, all the times a diagnostic came back clean and I accepted it completely and moved on. How many of those might have had something in the gap? And now I think that's the wrong way to frame it, he said. The question isn't how many times I might have missed something. The question is what I do with the knowledge that the gap exists. He looked at her. That's what you gave us. Not the correction, the awareness that there's something to correct for. She was quiet for a moment. 8 years of notebooks, she said. Not sadly, just accurately. And now the working group. And now the working group, she agreed. He turned to face her. Can I ask you something directly? Yes. When you walked in here 30 days ago, in the middle of the night, everyone's skeptical, my whole team looking at you like you were a mistake that Okafor had made. Did you know you were going to find it? She was quiet for a moment. No, eh? Did you think you might? She considered it. I thought there was something to find that wasn't where everyone was looking. I didn't know what it was or whether I would find it. I just knew the search space was wrong. She paused. I've spent my whole career looking for things in the wrong search space. When people have already checked everywhere they think to check, the answer is usually somewhere they didn't think to check. And you always know where that is. No, she said. I know where it isn't. That's different. Reynolds nodded slowly. They stood there for another minute in the quiet hangar. The 6 aircraft still and enormous and fully operational surrounding them in the particular stillness of machines at rest. The machines that had been silent for 3 days and then in 37 minutes had been given their voices back. Reynolds said, the protocol has a name now. Command named it. She looked at him. What is it? The Carter-Donnelly Environmental Interface Assessment Framework. He watched her face. It went out to all 7 installations this morning under that name. She didn't say anything for a moment. Donnelly's going to say you buried her name, Reynolds said. Donnelly's name comes first alphabetically, Emily said. I didn't bury anyone. He looked at her. It's alphabetical, she said again firmly. He nodded, keeping the expression off his face with some effort. Of course. She looked back at the helicopter, at the access panel, at the place where 30 days ago in the middle of the night, the answer had been waiting in a space just small enough to be invisible if you weren't looking from the right angle. There are people in Montana right now, she said. I know. People who have been working with equipment that doesn't have functioning diagnostics. People who have figured out how to read their machines directly because there's nothing else to read. And none of it is written down. None of it is anywhere that anyone can find it. We're going to change that, Reynolds said. We're going to try, she said. There's a difference, Carter. His voice was even, direct. We're going to change it. She looked at him, and something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know her would notice, but in the way that something shifts when a person who has learned to be careful with hope decides in one specific moment to stop being careful. Yes, she said, we are. The next morning, day 30, Whitmore called a full assembly, the entire base. Not a standard formation, he had the briefing room open to its full capacity, and he stood at the front and he told them, all of them, everything that had happened over the past 30 days in a sequence and clarity that made the story complete. Han told them about the helicopters. He told them about the 3 days. He told them about the phone call in the middle of the night and the woman who arrived with one bag. He told them about the 9 minutes in the panel and the 37-minute repair that had saved a 72-hour failure. He told them about the sensor that morning, the torque reading the 9 minutes again. He told them about the debrief and the protocol and the command response in the working group. I told them every part of it. And then he said, I want this room to understand something. What happened here was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was not the result of exceptional circumstances or unusual resources. What happened here was the result of one person asking a different question. Not a harder question, not a more sophisticated question, a different one. He paused. That person asked what the machine was not saying rather than what it was saying. And that question, that single shift in approach, produced a document that is now being implemented across 7 installations and a working group that is going to change how this service understands and uses technical knowledge at every level. The room was completely silent. The lesson, Whitmore said, is not that we need someone like Specialist Carter to walk in from outside every time we're stuck. The lesson is that the question she asked is available to all of us all the time. We can all ask what the system isn't telling us. We can all look in the gap. We can all step back far enough to see the pattern before we look for the part. He looked around the room. That is what I want this base to carry forward from the last 30 days. Not the story. The question. He stepped back from the podium. And then he did something that nobody had seen Colonel Daniel Whitmore do in 28 years of command. He started to applaud, not in the direction of the podium, not at the room generally, directly at Emily Carter, who was sitting in the third row. Reynolds started next, then Donnelly, then Hayes, then Okafor on his feet, then Alvarez, then one by one and then all at once 60 people in a briefing room in Alaska standing and applauding a maintenance specialist from logistics who had arrived in the middle of the night with one bag and no rank and had given them all something they hadn't known they needed. Emily Carter sat very still for a moment. She wasn't performing stillness. She wasn't managing emotion. She was just sitting with the specific, unpracticed experience of being seen, really seen for what she had actually done and who she had actually been doing it for years before anyone knew to look, and finding that it felt entirely different from anything she had imagined it would feel like on the nights in Montana when she had written in her notebooks in a room by herself with no one to give the knowledge to. It felt like the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. Then she stood up. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She just stood up and let the room be what it was and let the people in it be who they were and let the 30 days be what they had been and let the 12 months ahead of her be what they were going to be. Outside, the 6 aircraft sat in the hangar, quiet, operational, waiting. The machines had always been telling the truth. It had just taken one person working in the gap between what the systems said and what was actually there to finally hear them, and in hearing them to teach an entire unit, an entire command how to listen. That was the job. It had always been the job. And Emily Carter had been doing it for 8 years before